introduce Dr. Hurd now. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the penultimate installment of our STEM series. Glad you all could make it. Of course, next week's is going to be the rescheduled Deborah Willis talk. So anyway, today we have Dr. Stephen Hurd, and I'm really excited to introduce him today. I discovered his blog a while back. Actually, Dr. Lisa Russell-Pinson, our writing professor, recommended it to me. So Dr. Hurd is an evolutionary ecologist and entomologist at the University of New Brunswick, and he's published a couple of books. One is specifically for science writers, and one is for a more general audience called Charles Darwin's Barnacle and David Bowie's Spider, about scientific names. And then of course he has this blog, Scientists See Squirrel, which is followed by actual real life scientists and people such as myself as well. So it appeals to a wide audience, and it's very entertaining. So when we needed somebody to speak today, he came into my mind because he would probably be able to tell us all how to address many different audiences through our writing. So yeah, I guess, Dr. Hurd, I'll turn it over to you. And yeah, thanks for coming.
Okay, well, thank you, Aura, and thanks for having me today. I'm actually really pleased to be part of this series because science communication is critically important in today's world, right? And that's never been more obvious than it is now during a pandemic. Everything depends on science. Everything depends on science communication. And you're exactly right, Aura, that I want to talk about sort of what that means, because science communication happens in many different ways. It happens as communication from scientist to scientist, between scientists and policymakers, between scientists and the general public, and a lot more. And you've put together a really fascinating program and a great series of talks and workshops to address this. I'm really happy to be part of it, and I wish I'd been able to see all the rest of them. And my theme today is going to be that idea of science communication in many different ways. But I'm going to do it in a slightly weird way, I think, which is to tell you about my journey as a writer from grad school when I wrote my first scientific paper to this year when I published my second book, the one that Aura mentioned that's pictured on the slide here. And I think there's some useful lessons in all this about writing, about audiences. At least there have been for me. I hope that you'll agree with that. So who am I and why am I here? Well, as you've just heard, I'm an evolutionary ecologist. I mostly study interactions between insects and plants, but my research interests have actually been pretty broad. I've published on stream ecology and plant taxonomy and immune response to viruses and a bunch of other stuff. Basically, it turns out I just have a very short academic attention span, and that's actually why I called my blog Scientists See Squirrel, because I get easily distracted. I'm also a university professor. For the last 18 years, I've been here at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. If you don't know where that is, well, just drive east a little bit till you hit I-95, turn north, and then when you run out of Maine, you're almost there. So that's where I am. Before that, I was at the University of Iowa for a while, and like most of us in science, I've been around a fair bit. As a professor, I've taught courses in ecology, evolution, entomology, botany, statistics, scientific writing, and teaching is a form of scientific communication, but I'm just going to mention that, and then I'll admit that I won't say anything else about teaching as science communication today. And the third thing I am is a writer. So I've published a bunch of papers. I've published 82, I think, scientific papers so far. That's not a huge number, but especially for someone of my rather advanced age, but it's not embarrassing, at least. And some of them I think are pretty good. On the left of the slide is actually the first paper I ever wrote as a grad student. I'll talk about that a little bit. But when it's a writing talk, if I sort of say, who am I and why am I here? The why am I here part is usually, as Aura suggested, because of my writing book, which is the second bit from the left there, The Scientist's Guide to Writing. And so that is part of why I'm here today, and I will get to that, but I think it's not the whole reason. or I mentioned my blog, Scientist Sees Squirrel. That's the third little image over. And then I also just published my second book, Charles Darwin's Barnacle and David Bowie's Spider, over there on the right. That's a lot of writing. That's a lot of different kinds of writing. And I think that's really why I'm here today. And that's why I hope that you might find my writing journey to be interesting. Okay, so who's read a book by Stephen King? I mean, he sold 20 bazillion copies, so some of you must have read a book by Stephen King. The Stand, or It, or Carrie, or all these books. So imagine I asked you this really stupid question. Imagine I asked you this: do Stephen King and I have the same job, or do we have different jobs? So actually, we're going to experiment with this. I'm going to ask you to use the chat, if I can get it back on my screen, and tell me who thinks I have the same job as Stephen King and who thinks I have a different job. And hopefully I can recover the chat so I can see the answers. I minimized it and it's gone. I don't want to accidentally leave the meeting or anything too.
Well, if you can't see it, we got some votes for different job, same job, same job, same, different, same.
I got it back. Excellent.
Okay.
How clever of me. And thank you for moderating the chat as well. It's a little tricky because it wants to overlap the actual talk part of the screen. Okay, so same job, different job. Well, so I thought that was an obvious question when I was a grad student. Stephen King's a popular fiction writer, and I'm a scientist, so my job is to generate understanding of the natural world as it is. And Stephen King's job is to write novels about the world as we desperately hope that it isn't. So clearly we have different jobs. Well, that's what I would have told you, at least early in my career. If you'd asked sort of grad student me to describe my job as a scientist, I probably would have talked about designing experiments, about executing experiments, about analyzing data. I might have talked about reading the literature, but I would never have even mentioned writing. I knew, of course, that I would be writing. I knew I'd have to write my thesis, and I knew as well that I'd publish it because I knew that it really isn't science until it's not just done, but written up and published. Because the point of what we do, of course, is to add to human understanding of the world, right? Not just our own understanding. So I knew that writing mattered. But the thing is, I thought of it as this essentially mechanical step that would take care of itself once the data were in. To me, it was a task no more worthy of mention than maybe data entry or getting lunch or something like that. You can imagine how puzzled I was when in about my last year of grad school or so, I discovered I was spending way more time writing than I was doing any of those other bits that I would have described as my science. So my understanding of my job as a scientist has changed a lot. I now realize that writing is as central to my job as statistics or experimental design or teaching or anything else. It needs just as much attention. So if you asked me now, I'd answer my dumb question the other way. I would say that Stephen King and I have, to a very considerable extent, the same job. We write, we communicate with others. Now, sometimes we have the same audience and sometimes we have different audiences. In some ways that doesn't matter. Stephen King and I both still work to craft clear, persuasive text that tells an interesting story. But in other ways, it does matter that our audiences are different. As we'll talk about, clear, persuasive text isn't a thing you can define independently of the audience that it's aimed at. We'll get back to that. But I want to emphasize just how transformative it was for me to realize that Stephen King and I had the same job. Because if I think of myself as a writer, then it makes sense that I spend so much time not in the field, not at the lab bench, but sitting at my keyboard. It also makes sense that when I'm writing, I should not be trying just to write the paper I'm working on today, but also trying to hone my craft, trying to become a better writer and a faster writer. And so it would make sense that I might attend a workshop series like this one, as a participant, I mean, not necessarily as a presenter. It makes sense that I might read some books about writing. Stephen King wrote one. It's called On Writing. As I mentioned, I wrote one too. Mine's called The Scientist's Guide to Writing. Actually, I'd like to ask, we'll use the chat again. So how many of you have read a book about writing? And how many have read more than one? We'll give you a second to tell me in the chat. I have a me from Aura. Destiny's read 3, approximately 3. Good. So we have some yeses. We have a 2. So many of you have actually done this, and we have a couple of no's, and I'm reassured by that because when I was a grad student, or early in my career, I should say, even as a postdoc, I guess, it would not have occurred to me to read a book about how to write. It wasn't very. Yeah, I mean, it just literally wouldn't have occurred to me. It's a thing that you could do. But now, now that I conceive of myself as a writer, it makes just as much sense for me to read a book about writing as it does to read a book about stats or experimental design or pedagogy. So all these things that I've mentioned mean that being a writer now is sort of a big part of who I am. And it's been a bigger and bigger part of at least how I think about who I am as I've moved through my career. So that's the journey I've been promising to talk about. So I want to sort of tell you something about that journey now. So every journey, if I can get the slide to advance, there we go. Every journey starts with a first step. What I think of as my first step in scientific writing was this paper. It's a paper I published as a grad student, the first one. Notice though I have first steps in quotes. If you want to trace things back further, I was a co-author on a couple of papers before this. I didn't play a major role in the writing of them, but it's some. If you go back further still, as an undergrad, I was told that I should write my lab reports in the style of a scientific paper. I'll have more to say later, but just how much damage I think that does to the way people write. If you want to go back even further, I guess I learned writing more generally, all the way from kindergarten on up, but you don't need or want to hear about my life in elementary school today. So we'll start instead with my first paper here. I'm going to read you the first paragraph of the paper, not because I think you care about what the paper's about, because I want you to listen to its style, or maybe its lack thereof. The only thing I'll tell you about what the paper's about is it's about phylogenetic trees. And if anyone isn't familiar with this kind of biology, a phylogenetic tree is one of these diagrams like this one that shows evolutionary relationships among species. So here it happens to be us on the left and the other great apes, but it could be anything. So here's the paper again, and this is how it opens. So phylogenetic trees and their close relatives, cladograms and phenograms, vary in their balance. That is, the degree to which branch points define subgroups of equal size, figure 1. Balance is an interesting attribute of phylogenetic trees because patterns in balance can reveal important features of underlying evolutionary process. In particular, balance is influenced by variability of speciation and extinction rates among lineages. The more variable either rate, the less balanced the resulting trees. Variability in these rates provides the raw material for species sorting, Sensu Eldridge 1989, which has been suggested, e.g. Verba and Eldridge 1984, to reflect important macroevolutionary processes. Okay, what can we say about this? Well, it's pretty technical and it's a little bit dull. I mean, it gets worse on both accounts as you go through the paper. I mean, after all, the beginning of an introduction should be the most readable part of the whole paper. But it's not completely awful. I suspect you've probably read worse. And it got published in a journal, a good journal, Evolution. It's actually one of the top journals in my field. And it's been cited almost 200 times. So I'm pretty happy with this. I have to admit a lot of that is luck. I happened to publish this paper just as a whole bunch of people were getting interested in the shapes of phylogenetic trees. It's a longer story I won't tell, but I really didn't even start the work for a reason that in hindsight is very interesting, but it turned out to be cool. Anyway, a lot of people read the paper and a lot of them were interested enough in it to cite it. So, it's all been a pretty good success for a grad student paper that's technical and a little dull. When I wrote that paper, so who was I writing for? Well, I was writing, of course, for readers of this journal, Evolution, and that means other evolutionary biologists, but it's not even all of them, right? I was writing for a real subset, because evolutionary biology is a pretty broad field. I was writing for other people interested in the topic, interested in the shapes of phylogenetic trees, who would have some background to know what I was writing about. That's a pretty small audience. It's a pretty clearly defined audience. So other scientists in the same small subfield with much of the same, I guess, intellectual background that I had. And for the first 15 years or so of my career, this is really what I thought of as my only real output. What I did was I wrote papers about the results of my research. I wrote them for other scientists to read, and I got reasonably good at it. And if you've been writing papers too, you've realized that you can also get reasonably good at it by taking advantage of the very strictly standardized way that we write papers. So I know everyone's bored of seeing the IMRAD hourglass. I'm bored of it too, but it matters a lot. It's important. Since the scientific paper was invented, which was roughly in the middle 1660s, we've been gradually refining what has turned out to be a very efficient way to arrange information for communicating with each other, I mean, as scientists. And you know how this works. We've got the four major sections: introduction, methods, results, discussion, usually in that order. They're almost always really obvious. We put big headings on them saying introduction, methods, results, discussion. You really can't miss them. Within each section, there are also very standard substructures. They just aren't quite as obvious because we don't always label them. But John Swales, for example, talks about the standard succession of rhetorical moves in a scientific introduction. So here are those sort of three rhetorical moves. This is what we do in an introduction. First, we define a research territory. That really means explaining how our work fits into the broadest possible context in the field. Then we narrow that down to establish our own niche within the territory. So we identify a knowledge gap that needs to be filled. And we narrow that down still further to occupy that niche, to explain how our particular paper is going to fill that knowledge gap. And this is a series of moves that sits behind the narrowing of that hourglass, from the broadest general context at the beginning to, at the end, specific information about the research to come. And you might not notice those moves as you read an introduction because they don't have subheads or anything, but they're there. And in other sections, there are similar typical standard sequences of moves, rhetorical moves that we use. And one point of doing all this is it makes it very easy for readers to extract from a paper what they need to. So, do you want to find a method that you could potentially use in your system? Well, you know to go straight to the method section, right? Do you want to know why the paper is important? Well, first paragraph of the introduction. Do you want to know what exact question the authors were trying to answer? Aha, well, that's going to be the last paragraph of the intro, and so on. So the standardization makes it much easier for a scientist reader to read the paper, but it also makes it much easier for a writer to produce the paper. I said easier, not easy. Writing is never easy, but at least you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Right? This isn't experimental postmodernist theater. If you can produce these elements in this order, then readers will understand what you're doing in your paper. Which readers? Well, I said this, I think, before, other scientists, right? Papers are a way we talk to each other. We're good at reading papers. We have lots of practice. When you write an IMRAD paper, you're writing it in a particular form for an audience that's very good at reading that form. You wouldn't expect a politician or a high school student or a lawyer to digest an IMRAD scientific paper, at least not easily, but you would expect me to. I didn't think much about any of that for a long time because I was busy doing what most scientists do. I was churning out papers that told other scientists about the results of my own research. I started writing papers more or less in about 1991. So you fast forward about 20 years, and then things start to get a little strange. I'd been mentoring by, 2010 or so. I'd been mentoring grad students for quite a while, and I got thinking about that. And here's what I thought. It's something in hindsight I realize now was dumb. I thought, oh gosh, I thought if I keep telling, sorry, I'm going to back that up a little bit. I thought I just keep telling one grad student after another all the same things about writing. Wouldn't it be easier if I just wrote it all down? And that was the germ of the idea that became the Scientist Guide to Writing. And I said it was a dumb idea. It was dumb. It was not easier to just write it all down. It took me 5 years, more or less, to write the book. It was published in 2016. I'll have to say I am proud of it. Some of my happiest days are when I hear from early career people who tell me they have found it helpful in their own writing journey. So it's pretty exciting. And I learned a ton writing the book. So first, I learned a lot about scientific writing in general. I dug really deep into what we know about the history of rhetoric in scientific writing and into the psychology of writing. In my own case, that has a lot to do with the psychology of procrastination and distraction. And if you've read any pieces of the book, you know that's in there in a big way. But I also learned a ton about my own writing, not just behavior, but what I wrote, because I knew this book would have a different audience from my papers. It wasn't good enough to write for other scientists in my own field, other scientists who wanted to know about my results and would put up with a little bit of tedium to get there. I wanted early career folk from all fields to read a whole book. So I figured it had to be at least a little bit engaging. So how could I do that? Well, you'll have to pick up a copy to find out if I succeeded or not, but I'm going to read you again, just the first paragraph or so. And it goes like this. In the European early modern period, everything was changing. The period saw the Protestant Reformation, the origins of the modern nation state. It saw globalization of trade in goods and ideas, but also subjugation of much of the world under European colonization. Science is transforming itself right alongside everything else. European curiosity cabinets were bulging with specimens returned from overseas trade, specimens begging to be explained by new ideas in the natural sciences. Chemistry took its first steps away from alchemy towards rational discovery, and the invention of the calculus gave mathematics its key place, the center of all the sciences. But while the content of human knowledge was exploding, another change was taking place, and arguably it's a more important one. The way human knowledge was communicated changed too. In case you are wondering about the point of this historical excursion, this is the time when scientists learned how to write, invented modern style scientific writing. So that's a little weird, right? Like in my papers, I've never mentioned alchemy or the Protestant Reformation. And it feels a bit different too to me. We have sort of colorful language like curiosity cabinets bulging with specimens and those specimens begging to be explained. I was experimenting with style. I talked a moment ago about the standardized structure of a scientific paper. We have a standardized style too. The second sentence on this slide fits that style. It's from the paper I just read you a little bit of the introduction from. Expected distributions of the balance index were obtained for a null hypothesis of random constant rate speciation. That sentence, well, it's in the passive voice, a horrible convention that happily we're leaving behind. It's formal, it's dry, it uses precise technical language. You could arguably say jargon. The only thing that second sentence there is missing really is a half a dozen or so acronyms, and then it would be like the perfect scientific sentence, right? What I wrote for the Scientist Guide to Writing on the top is very different. And what I wrote for the book was really fun, actually. I even managed in a single footnote to refer to California Condors and the 1980 Grammy Award for Best Disco Recording. If you want to know what those have in common, you're going to have to read the book to find out. I discovered that I liked writing in a less technical way. I liked writing about the history and the culture of science. I liked making kind of obscure connections and trying to do all that with a more conversational, more engaging style. So how could I do more of that? Well, I knew it wouldn't be very smart to do it in my scientific papers. I try to do a little bit of it now in papers. I'll return to that idea, but the audience for my papers has certain expectations about style, and I need to meet those expectations if I expect to communicate effectively. So instead, in 2015, I started my blog, Scientist Sees Squirrel. Now blogs are very much out of style these days over the last dozen years or so. Uh, have been dwindling, and those that survive see much less readership. People have about the etymology, the handwriting.
Stephen, we're losing you a little bit.
Okay, are you hearing me again?
Yes, we are now, but the
Okay, I'm
last
not
probably 30 to
not
40
sure what
seconds.
happened. I just lost you completely for a minute, and it came back up.
Okay, maybe you could back up like 30 seconds.
Will do, sure. Let's see. So I think I was talking about starting a blog, and blogs falling out of style. Was that before I got lost? It was. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so on the blog, I publish about once a week or so, maybe a little more. I write about statistics. Is my screen still being shared? No, it's not.
No, we
Hang on.
can see the blog.
I lost that as well. We'll okay, I'm gonna say it out loud because I can't. Thank you very much. I write about stats and teaching and etymologies of Latin names, the history of science and scientific writing, and a whole lot more. Since there's no one to tell me that I can't do it, I experiment a bit with writing style. And what I've developed, I think, is something of a writer's voice. So voice in writing, voice is the set of features and quirks that by which you can tell whether you're reading a novel by Ernest Hemingway or Kurt Vonnegut or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So it's partly a matter of vocabulary, partly a matter of phrasing, partly its attitude. It's a bunch of other things as well. If you read a few posts, you could sort of decide what my voice is. But I think I have one. I think you can tell if you're reading my blog on top there, rather than Small Pond Science or Dynamic Ecology. These are two other rather similar blogs. The idea of having a writer's voice would be totally uninteresting if I was talking in a series of creative writing workshops. Everyone in that world knows all about voice. But in science, I think this is interesting because our scientific literature papers, I think, almost entirely lacks voice. And that is, I think you couldn't tell from the writing alone if you were reading a paper by me or by Terry McGlynn or by Jeremy Fox, even though you could easily tell our blog writing apart. We've converged in papers not just on that standard IMRAD format, but in a very rigid style too. So you can instantly tell a paper apart from a blog post, but I don't think you can tell my paper from your paper very easily. And I've written about that on my blog, so it's something I won't spend more time on now. I left a bunch of links in the chat at the beginning, and there's a post linked there that talks about this issue of voice in writing. Instead, I want to talk about a little bit about what blogging taught me about audience, and therefore, interestingly, about scientific journals. So these are just a few of the posts I've published on Scientist Sees Squirrel. There's like 400 or so in total, which is astonishing to me. But here are some of the titles I've used. And here I'm going to ask you to use the chat again and tell me who you think my audience is. Who am I writing for? If you sort of just look at the topics reflected here, it means I have to find the chat again. got the chat again. So we have teachers, we have academic professors. I'll give it a moment if anyone else has other ideas. College students and above. Yeah, I think I would totally agree with you folks. On the blog, I'm writing almost all the time for other scientists at different levels, from students on up, but other scientists, not necessarily people in my own field, but scientists. And I think that's not particularly evident from the voice I'm writing in, which is usually fairly non-technical, but it's evident, I think, from the topics. But there's an exception on this slide, and I think it's a sort of a telling one. It's at the upper right, 3 Witches in the Woods. This is a short article I wrote for the newsletter of our local botanic garden. And so its audience is the general public. It's what people would call SciComm. And having written it, I figured, well, I wrote it, I might as well get some extra mileage out of it. So I posted it on my blog as well. And what happened? Well, nothing. Nobody read it. I mean, not quite nobody, but over 3 years, it's accumulated 347 page views. In about half that time, a post I wrote about the etymology of the Latin abbreviation CF has had 14,000 views. So what's going on here? So it's possible that I suck at SciComm, but I'm really good at writing posts about obscure Latin. I'm getting warnings about my internet connection. Again, this is not encouraging. I hope we're going to be okay. Please let me know if things go awry. I think what's going on here is not that I'm awful at SciComm and rock at Latin abbreviations. I think what's happening here is this is about audience again. I think audience matters in 2 ways. So it matters, first of all, in that it determines the way you write, the language you use, the background you supply, stuff like that. But audience also matters in distribution, in the mechanisms you use to get what you've written into the hands of the audience you want to reach. So the average person on the street doesn't pick up a copy of Nature, and a scientist looking for information about, let's say, vaccine efficacy doesn't pick up a copy of National Enquirer to look for it. Nature and National Enquirer are both distribution mechanisms that are designed and built to place particular kinds of information in front of particular audiences who are looking for it. And what I had accidentally built with Scientist Sees Squirrel was a distribution mechanism that primarily reaches other scientists. So yes, my Uncle Jim reads it and my friend Caroline reads it, but the overwhelming majority of the folks who read it are scientists, and they aren't going to be all that interested in a pure sort of SciComm post. At least they're not going to tell their friends about it, they're not going to pass it on, and I think you can see that reflected in the readership for these. Now, every good rule has an exception, and often the exception proves the rule. I wrote this post just this summer after there was a court case in Alabama that turned on the fact that legally, at least in Alabama, spiders are insects. And many of you are probably going, oh, well, come on, spiders aren't insects. And of course, biologically, they aren't insects. But the judge in this case wrote a surprisingly well-researched decision arguing that in law, spiders are insects, and I have to admit it was pretty convincing. Well, this post got almost 17,000 views, and it got most of them in 3 days. And that happened because it got linked to very widely. Most importantly, it got linked to by whatever magic algorithm puts those suggested web pages on your blank browser window when you open it up. And so basically this sort of went semi-viral, very semi, right? I mean, I don't go really viral, but this went sort of semi-viral. And you may be thinking this contradicts my claim that real SciComm wouldn't be seen if I put it on my blog, but not really, because it turns out all these views were a one-time thing. Almost none of these 17,000 people started following Scientist Sees Squirrel. Most they might have looked at maybe like the one post before this, thought it was dull, and that was it. They never came back. This post was a flash in the pan. And it's not surprising because I think people return to distribution channels that give them the content they want. So you could publish a really insightful article about entomology in a golf magazine, and maybe some entomologists might even read it, but they wouldn't all start subscribing to the golf magazine. And this is why I'm skeptical. I said I'd bring this back to journals. This is why I'm skeptical when I hear people say we don't need journals anymore. People say, well, keyword searching brings you all the papers you ever need. We don't need to look at the journal anymore. But I don't think that's the way humans operate. I think we pay attention to journals. And I mean, even people who claim they don't pay attention to journals, I think do, because those journals work as a mechanism for sorting content to audience that may not any longer involve people subscribing to journals or going to the library to read tables of contents every month, but at least it involves the signaling value of a journal for the paper that appears in it. So for example, if I see the words ecological monographs or Canadian entomologist on top of a paper, that tells me something. It tells me a lot actually about what might be in that paper and whether I'm likely to be interested in it. And I think this is one reason that PLOS One is dying. So PLOS One, as you probably know, is a mega journal. It publishes really almost anything across all the sciences. Doesn't matter whether it's biology or science. Doesn't matter whether it's basic science or applied science. Doesn't matter whether it's earth-shaking or a routine confirmation of something. So basically what the words PLOS One on the top of a paper do is not much. They don't tell you anything about whether you might be interested in reading that paper. And here's a graph of its publication output through time. It's the blue line. You can see huge growth in the from 2007 till about 2013, at a time when this idea of a journal that published sort of everything was a novelty, but then long continued decline since then. And I've published in PLOS One, and it turns out it's actually a really good way to get a paper into print. But it's a terrible way to get a paper in front of the readers who might be interested in it. So publishing in PLOS One is kind of the equivalent of throwing a paper up there in the wind and hoping that somebody catches it. Sometimes they do, but not a heck of a lot. And I think the people who publish PLOS One actually know this, because now PLOS publishes a bunch of topical journals. For example, PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases. Well, guess what kind of scientist reads PLOS Neglected Tropical Diseases, right? Scientists who are interested in neglected tropical diseases. They found a mechanism for getting papers about neglected tropical diseases in front of scientists who want to read about them. Turns out that writing for your audience isn't enough. You have to find your audience too. So blogging taught me that, but scientific journals, I think, confirm it. So blogging also taught me that even when I'm writing for mostly scientists, I really like writing less formally, less technically, and I love being able to explore topics that are away from my own research, even topics that might seem a little bit peculiar. So to do more of that, I started work on another book. So this time it's a book aimed at the general public. So it's true SciComm, or in the publishing jargon, it's a trade book. Was published last April, which by the way was a terrible time to launch a book. There were other things happening in April, pandemic and stuff. People were distracted, can't imagine why. Anyway, I did it anyway. So Charles Darwin's Barnacle and David Bowie's Spider, it's a book about scientific names. As you know, each species has a scientific or sometimes called Latin name. And I'm really fascinated by those names, how species get those names and how they're coined. I'm especially interested in so-called eponymous names. That's species that are named after people. So that's David Bowie's spider on the slide, Heteropoda David Bowie. Notice the long, skinny legs and the bright orange hair. If you're old like me and remember Bowie in his Ziggy Stardust phase, you'll know why it was named that. Turns out that species names like this are a great lens through which to look at the personalities of the scientists who coined the names and to look at the way we connect our natural world to our human culture. So I tell stories in the book about species scientists have named after their heroes, about species scientists have named to insult their enemies, about species scientists have named for their husbands and wives and lovers, about species scientists have named for themselves. That last one, you may believe you're not allowed to do that, but you are actually, and people occasionally do. We just pretty much all agree it's in bad taste and we shouldn't. There are some amazing stories to be told, and I think they reveal a lot about the human side of scientists. So I'm hoping readers and the general public get something out of that. But I'm here really to talk more from the writing end. So as a writer, This was another step on that journey I've been talking about. The book's very non-technical. I think it's sort of comparable to like a National Geographic article, something like that. And it's really more about natural history and human personality than it is about biology or taxonomy. And I wrote with more experimenting with style even than ever, which was really fun. So again, I'm going to read you the opening paragraph. It goes like this. You and I are primates. Our lineage among mammals stretches back 75 million years. In some ways, there hasn't been a terribly successful lineage. Only 504 living primate species are known to science, compared with, for example, 26,000 species of orchids and 60,000 of weevils. At the same time, though, ours is a lineage that has transformed the planet as no other ever has. We can be both ashamed and proud of that. It's true that no species has ever polluted so many lakes, raised so many forests, or driven so many other species near or to extinction. But it's also true that no species has ever thirsted so much to understand its world, and no species has ever made so much progress toward that goal. Like every species, we have our local preoccupations with territory, food, and mates, but we've also looked up from them to study and name rocks, plants, animals, landforms, even planets and stars. Well, that is not a way I would ever write in a scientific paper. And that's because the audiences are really different, right? We write for the audience that we're targeting. But that might seem to suggest that writing scientific papers and blogging for scientists and writing SciComm for the general public are three totally separate things. And that's definitely not true. And that's one more thing I've learned along this writing journey. There are at least two different ways that my different kinds of writing, I think, are connected to each other. I'll call them transferability, which sounds like horrible jargony, and feedbacks. So first, transferability. What I'm getting at there is that writing skills are transferable. Writing for different audiences has made me a better writer for each. That's true of my writing process. Writing as a verb, I write more quickly and more easily now just through endless practice. But it's also true, I think, of my writing as a noun, the product. I've been able to try out sentence structures and phrasing and style in one kind of writing that I can then borrow in another. So time spent writing or time spent learning how to write better, I think, is never wasted because writing is one of the most transferable of all skills. Almost any imaginable career that you might have will involve writing. And any kind of writing will make you better at any other kind. So that's what I mean by transferability. But it's the second connection that I'm calling feedbacks that I think is actually more interesting, because writing for different audiences, writing for non-technical audiences has actually changed the way I write my scientific papers. I'm going to focus on a very small example of that. Look there in this sentence from Charles Darwin's Barnacle. It's a contraction. You virtually never see it's in a scientific paper. It's always it is. So why is that? And in fact, English has about 30 or so common contractions, and we don't use any of them in scientific papers. Other abbreviations like acronyms, we love those, can't get enough. But for whatever reason, contractions we avoid. So why is that? Well, I got curious about that for some reason. I don't remember why now. But I asked a bunch of people, and I got two different kinds of answers. So the first kind, the less common answer, was that contractions might make reading more difficult for scientists who speak English as an additional language, EAL, English as an additional language. And that actually makes some sense, and it's a good example maybe of considering your audience. So globally, most scientists are not native speakers of English. Most scientists are EAL scientists. And so maybe we should not use contractions if those are hard for them. But I wondered if they really were that hard. So I set up a Twitter poll. Now, look, I understand that Twitter polls are toys. You can't take their interpretation very far, but sometimes they're really clear, and this is one of those times. A bunch of EAL scientists took the poll, and overwhelmingly, they say that contractions are a minor obstacle at most. Contractions don't bother EAL scientists. What bothers EAL scientists are things like long, complicated sentences, dull writing, jargon, all the same things that bother you and me about scientific literature. So our avoidance of contractions, I think, can't be justified by this concern for EAL readers. But remember I said that was the less common of the answers I got. The more common answer was this: we don't use contractions because it isn't appropriate scientific style, isn't appropriate scientific writing. And that brings me to backpedaling a little bit about audience. So yes, we do write for an audience, and good writers do give the audience what they need and what they expect, but not too much. Because we don't use contractions because it isn't appropriate scientific style. That's completely circular logic, right? And it's a particular case of something more general I call the tyranny of circular expectations. It's a trivial example, I'll admit, but it's one good example. The same people you see are both the audience for scientific writing and also the producers of scientific writing. And you'd think that would let us deliver just what we need, but in a weird way, it actually makes our writing worse, not better. You've seen this happen if you've ever been the TA in an undergraduate lab. We tell our students, write this up as a scientific paper. And they dutifully go off to the library, or maybe they fire up Sci-Hub or something like that, and they read some papers. And what they find there is terrible. It's tedious, it's turgid, it's stuffed with acronyms and jargon, it's stiffly formal, and it never has any contractions in it. And so they learned that that's what science sounds like. And we've told them to write like that, and so they do. And then they become us. And we keep writing our literature this way because our expectations have been molded by what's already written. Well, this, of course, is an excellent way to make sure that our writing can never get any better. And so, while yes, we should consider our audience when we write, for sure, I think we shouldn't pander to it completely. And my own small act of rebellion now is that I do use some contractions in my papers, just a few, just as I do in blogging and just as I do writing books. I think it makes my writing a little bit more engaging. Sometimes editors will suggest that I take the contractions out, but I ignore them. Sometimes copy editors remove them. I put them back in. Sometimes by the time the paper occurs in print, I've lost this battle. Occasionally I've won it. And look, I know it's not going to revolutionize our literature. But if we want to, and if we all commit these little acts of rebellion, we can make our literature a little bit less dreadful to read. And I think that's worth doing. So this has been a bit of a winding road, this talk, just like my writer's journey has been. Let me finish up by asking myself this. Imagine I had a chance to talk to my past self. Imagine I could get a message to me as a grad student. What would I say? Well, I tipped myself off about that really good restaurant I didn't find till the end of my grad program, but that's sort of a different story. What do I say about writing? So first of all, I tell myself to write a lot. The more you write and the more different things you write, the easier it gets and the better you do it. I'd also tell myself to write consciously. And what I mean by that is to think about what you're writing and why you're writing it that way, to think about how your writing fits into the history and culture of writing, both scientific writing and other kinds. I think the kinds of realization I've talked about today are useful, and they come only to those who are thinking consciously, deliberatively about their writing, to people who interrogate themselves as writers and also as readers. I tell myself to always remember my audience, to think first about how that audience should shape what I'm writing, and also to think about how what I've written will find its way to that audience. But I've put the word mostly there because remember, I think I should remember not to pander completely to an audience that's been trained by the sins we've committed in our past writing. And finally, I tell myself to take some chances in writing, to write something weird, to write something no one else cares about, to write something stylish, to write something passionate, maybe just not all four of those things at the same time. So I'm going to wrap up this part of it here, and thanks for your time. Here's some ways to find more of my writing. And if you scroll back to the very beginning of the chat, I dropped links to all kinds of things there. I think I've left lots of time for questions and discussions, so I'd like us to do that. Or Angela, how would you like to handle that? Do you want people to put questions in the chat or just on mute? What works best for you guys?
What works best for you?
I'm easy.
Well, I mean, sometimes we say, like, you should turn your camera on and then you can physically raise your hand to ask a question. That works. People also seem to really enjoy just messaging straight into the chat box, though, when they're shy.
Well, we got one in the chat. We can start with that one.
Okay.
Okay, so if I want to start writing a blog about my research, is it a good idea to write the first articles just about the field, or is it wiser to jump into the topics? Well, that's a good question. I think it depends on, in your mind, who you want to be reading this blog that you're going to start. I think you could think of it as a very small ongoing scientific meeting between you and your closest colleagues, and write only about the particular subjects that you're publishing on in a more technical way. You could imagine, though, that you're talking more broadly to the public, and maybe they're interested in a wider array of things. So I don't think there's a single right answer to that. I think it really depends on what you think this blog is going to do and who it's going to be for. Wasn't that unhelpful?
So Ravani, if you want to unmute yourself and put your camera on and have a discussion back and forth about this, I think Q&A is nice. It's nice to unmute your cameras, so I'd encourage anyone who's comfortable to do that so you can follow up and such.
Actually, it answers my question, but I mean, in our case at least, we usually, for example, if we want to inspect anything like crash data, we don't want to trigger any one from our analysis. For example, in one of my recent studies, I was analyzing something like teen crashes, and in that I don't want to penalize anyone, but at the same time if I want to just convey the message that these are some of the safer ways where they can avoid such crashes or even some accidents or improve safety. That was the one which I was more interested in, how to just convey that very in a very polite way, at the same time not just focusing on the technical aspects as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I think you're thinking about the right way, which is to think about, okay, so who are the people who will be reading this? What will they think about when they read it? And where do I want to leave them? Do I want to upset them? Do I want to reassure them? Do I want to give them the tools to learn more? I think you're thinking about that conversation you're going to have with those readers. So I think that's a good way to get your head around it anyway.
Thank you.
The question in the chat from is Amiante correct? How do I pronounce your name?
That's exactly it. Thank you.
Oh, wow, good for me. So you're in the middle of writing a course paper, but is struggling with actually completing it. What are writing routines you use and productivity tips? Oh, well, so yes. So I totally hear you there. I'm awful. I get distracted so easily. Oh, yes, or good idea. Or I will take my screen share off so we can all see each other better. Thank you. Good call. So one thing that I do, I recommend people do, first of all, is to try to understand your own writing behavior, is to sort of try to notice it for a while. I did something once called a 6-minute writing log, where I set a little alarm clock and it went off every 6 minutes. And I just wrote down what I was doing at that instant. And what I found, when it went off and I wrote down what I was doing, I was mostly like looking at my email or checking Twitter or reading a comic or something like that. So that's when I sort of understood just how awful I was about distraction. And so then you have, okay, well, how am I going to fix that? So in my own personal case, when I'm struggling with it, I've actually learned that Pomodoros work fairly well for me. If you know what that is, it's a technique where you basically set a timer for 25 minutes that you do nothing but your focal work for 25 minutes. When it goes off, you have a 5-minute break and you just repeat that cycle. For whatever reason, that I think seeing the timer in front of me sort of helps me not distract myself. There are other tools, removing those distractions from yourself. There are apps you can use that will lock down things like Facebook and Twitter on your computer until a certain time has passed and things like that. Those might work for some people. In my writing book, I actually have several chapters on this, and there's a lot of different possibilities. A lot of it is sort of experimenting and finding what works to make you in particular. It may not be the same thing that works for me, makes you more productive. Scheduling is also really, I think, important to write regularly and to block off times at which you know you're most productive and have that in your calendar so it becomes a default routine that you know, oh, this time of day, it's my writing time. I'm going to sit down and do it. That works really well for a lot of people, not for everybody. When I wrote the book, one of the reviewers was kind of upset that I didn't give very much like unconditional advice, like do this, do this. There's a whole lot of like lists of try this and this and this and this and see what works best. But I really actually believe that what you need is sort of a big toolbox to try and see what works best for you. So those are a few ideas. So Destiny, the Forest app, I don't know that one, but it sounds like it's another one of these things that sort of helps you control when you're working on your actual thing and when you're doing something else. Is that true?
Yeah, so it's a timer that you can set, and you start growing a tree, and if you set it for 45 minutes, if you exit the app and go to like any other app other than answering your phone calls, it'll kill your tree. So it's like total
cool.
motivation to keep focusing so your tree doesn't wither. And it keeps a map of it for an entire year. So you can see like all the trees you've grown over a year, and you can see all the ones that have withered. So it's, for me, it's been like a really good motivation, even though it's like a virtual tree. I'm like, I don't want to kill this tree. I don't want to kill this tree.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and they
Yeah.
have a free version of it that anybody can use. And then like I think it's like $1.99. And if you do that version, then they start planting trees based on like how much time you focus. So I was like, okay, it's $1.99. Let's do this.
That sounds really cool, actually. I think I would probably be respond well to that as well. Thank you. So another question in the chat about how do you tackle a larger writing project like a book or a thesis? I find the magnitude of the task makes it difficult to even know where to begin. Oh yeah, absolutely. So I actually read about this in the writing book as well. There's some fairly straightforward psychology about this. You're completely normal in a big task is really daunting. And there's actually a psychological model of procrastination theory that sort of explains in part why this might be, why humans are very unlikely to start big tasks. And one of the key ways for me is to break it down into a bunch of little tasks. When I write even a paper, I don't focus on finishing the whole paper. I focus on the next little bit. So I start with something really easy like the acknowledgements or the title page. And when it's finished, I feel really good about it. And breaking it down into manageable steps. Today, I'm not going to write a paper today. Today, I'm going to write the second paragraph of the discussion, and I'm going to tidy up my references. And you can even set goals like that, small goals, and give yourself modest rewards for finishing them. So, you know what? If I can finish that second paragraph and tidy up my references, I can have a piece of chocolate and go for a walk. Now, you got to be honest, right? You don't get the chocolate unless you finish the second paragraph and tidy up your references. But you might, if you're like me, you might respond well to sort of gamification of your own behavior and give yourself a reason to look forward to this attainable goal instead of focusing on the end goal. Because yeah, I mean, it took 5 years to write the Scientist Guide to Writing. There's no way I would have stuck with it if I hadn't had a whole bunch of sort of intermediate steps in mind. So break it up. Destiny says daily writing goals down in a planner. Yeah, so I think that's one way of sort of making them real and sort of semi-official maybe, and so that when you finish it, you have the satisfaction then of crossing it out, right? I bet you really enjoy crossing one out. Am I right? Yeah. So there's my to-do list, and I every now and again I will put something on that I actually just finished, just so I can cross it out.
I do that all the time too. I'm like, I have so many lists just everywhere, and I'm like, I watered the plants, and then I'll like write it down and cross it off, just so it makes me feel good and motivates me to keep doing things. I think it's super beneficial.
And a lot of this too, like I don't expect that'll work for everybody the way it works for Destiny and for me, but you need to sort of experiment with different tricks like this. There are some things like, for example, in the book I talk about ways to outline to find the structure of a piece of writing before you tackle it. And there's a technique called concept mapping. I don't know if anyone knows about it, but it's basically a kind of a flow chart way of defining an outline before you start writing something. And I hate it. It doesn't work for me at all. It's awful. But I have friends and colleagues who love it, and it works really well for them. And so the only way to find this stuff out is to try a bunch of stuff. Some of it won't work for you. That's okay. It doesn't mean you're wrong or broken or anything. It just means that not everyone's the same. Some things will work for you. You find out what they are, and you stick with them. The way that Destiny has her crossing things out in the forest app, the way I have my similar list. So experiment with techniques. And this is probably what I mean about writing consciously, sort of being aware of yourself and how you're responding to your writing, and how, if you were productive today, what made you productive today? Was it the environment? Was it the way you broke up the tasks? If today was a horrible writing day, sort of try to be honest with yourself. Well, what went wrong? Did you just get distracted all the time? Were you trying to polish something rather than just getting a whole draft out? What was it? So being aware of your own writing behavior, even though it's sometimes really embarrassing. Like if your behavior is like mine, it could be super embarrassing to be aware of what you're doing when you're supposed to be writing. But if you can do it and get to it, it can really help. Oh, I don't know tiny habits, Aura, but that's exactly right. Celebrate the small victories, and if you do that, as long as you keep taking steps forward, right, the journey advances.
I have a question to put out sort of to you and our students who are listening today. It's conventions in disciplines about writing take on a life of their own, right? So how much can students like these who are just sort of beginning their careers, not even done with school, how much do they have to be careful about not being too bold, not be, writing in that tradition that you outlined, versus how many risks can they take? And I guess to the students, my question is, do you feel comfortable taking that kind of risk? Or do you feel like if you wrote something really compelling, your advisor would look at you like, what is this?
Let me start on that while people have a chance to think. So yeah, I think it's totally unfair to ask the earliest career people to take the risks in changing writing very much. So I think we should all be making what I call these small acts of rebellion, but keeping them small. And I think those of us who are old should be taking the bigger risks, perhaps. So I would encourage students to pay attention to those conventions in your field or even your subfield, but to think about if there are any that could use just a little gentle poke. And if you try something like, let's say you put a few contractions in a manuscript, and let's say your advisor crosses them out with fierce intensity and sends it back to you. Well, it's actually okay to say, hey, let's talk about why we do that. Do you think there's a good reason that we shouldn't use those, or is there? And it's not like you're going to be horribly crushed if in the end they win. It won't be the first or the last time that you've negotiated something about writing. And it's interesting to have that conversation because often you'll find that they will have, crossed out your contractions or whatever the thing is, but not really thought about it. When you say, well, I realize it's not common in the field, but here's the reason I did it. What do you think? You can have a useful discussion about it. But small things, I think, small nudges at the conventions of the field, not out and out flat out rebellion, because obviously your readers do have expectations that you need to be accommodating. How would you folks feel about, so contractions is a trivial one, I admit, but so who would be comfortable writing a contraction in a scientific paper or a technical paper, and who would think it was horrifying?
I think I would be comfortable with it. I very much like the structure that we do. So like, the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. I love that format, but I think that it could be a lot more intuitive and easily read. So I think I would probably be comfortable trying to submit, a manuscript with contractions and more like colloquial speak in it than I was in my master's degree. So I think it's needed. I think it's to liven up some of the texts and just to make it easier and easily digestible.
I would also suggest that in a case like what you're describing, Destiny, it's highly unlikely that that is going to be the thing that on which reviewers reject a paper. They might suggest that you change it, which in that case you can always back down. But it's unlikely to be the paper succeeds or fails on that. So Amiante had a second question here. What part of a research paper do you think a grad student should start writing first? Well, I'll tell you one thing, which is that when I was starting, I always wrote the introduction first because that was the beginning. What's that annoying song from those? I think it's The Sound of Music, right? About start at the beginning. It's a very good place to start. It's a terrible place to start. Don't do that. And my students now all still want to start with the introduction. And actually, when I teach scientific writing, it's quite awkward because I tell them not to, but their advisors tell them to start with the introduction. I think that's the worst place to start. I think you should start with either the methods, because you can write them while you're still doing the work, or with the results, because those are straightforward, then the discussion, and last, the introduction. The reason I keep the introduction for last is because I think the introduction is there to set up everything I say. Everything I do in the paper should be introduced, should be set up, should be hinted at more than hinted at, more explicit than that in the intro. But until I write the discussion, I don't know what it is I'm setting up. So how can I write the introduction when I don't yet know what it is I'm introducing? So I do it what's called writing backwards, starting with the results and discussion, then writing the methods that got you those results, then write the introduction that introduces everything. Now, I just told you a lie. I don't actually start with the results or the methods. I start with the acknowledgements because they're so easy. And my brain is so stupid that I can trick myself into thinking I'm being productive by writing the acknowledgements. So I start with the acknowledgements and usually the title page, not the title of the paper. That's hard. I start with like my address and stuff because somehow after I've done that, I think this is going great. I'm making progress, and it helps me get into the rest of it. That's what I actually do. The beginning, the middle, and the end, but not necessarily in that order. I would say stronger. I would say right at the beginning, the middle, and the end, but definitely not in that order. Let's see. So now we have the backbone for our paper. Do you think our concept is the best way? Or do you think the concept could be improved, or is it outdated? So our IMRAD structure is not the only way you can tell a scientific story. And we do have some reasonably dramatic variation. There are methods last journals, for example. They're not quite as methods last as you would think if you actually read them, but anyway. There are probably other good effective ways to tell a story, but part of what's going on here is that we're really good at that structure because everyone uses that structure. And so there's sort of like a local optimum here where we've converged on this, and because we all write that way, we're also very good at reading that way. And I suspect that if we all tried some other way, no, that would be okay. If a few of us tried some dramatically different way of writing science, I think it would be less effective, just because it would be so unusual for everybody. Part of it is the IMRAD structure, sort of a finding system I talked about, where you can go straight to the part of the paper you want to read. Does that mean that we could never write papers a different way? I don't necessarily think it's the perfect system. And we'll see. There are journals out there tinkering with different kinds of things. Think of like the Journal of Visual Experiments, or papers that are trying to use enhanced graphical abstract systems and things like that. So there's tinkering going on. The problem is I'm kind of old, so I'm not the one who's going to be driving or maybe even responding to these really major upheavals in the way we write science. I think we've evolved a really effective system that's very efficient to use. I do totally agree with Destiny and others that we could write within that structure. We could write a lot better, but I think the structure itself is really awfully good. A couple of blogging questions. Destiny says, interested in a ton of topics like you are. Do you find writing about multiple topics or fields has been beneficial to your blog, or if you go back, would you focus? I'm going to say no on both of those, which seems contradictory. Focus. The literature on blogging, such as it is, the literature on SciComm, and it's consistent with what I said about finding audiences, is that more focus is better. In particular, the way I'm trying to write to other scientists and to the public at the same time is not particularly effective. But here's the thing, I like doing it. It's my damn blog, so I'm going to do it anyway. Knowing that it could be costing me audience, I suppose. So if I went back and did it over again, I would be similarly unfocused. I still throw occasional straight up SciComm posts on there, even knowing they're not going to get much traction. I figure I'll put them up, people can ignore them. But I know I have colleagues who actually maintain two blogs. They have a science blog and a SciComm blog, and they sort their posts to the appropriate one. And that, maybe I should have done that, I don't know. Aura says, how do I schedule my posts? Do I write a bunch of posts at once or write as I go along? Yes, both. So I actually have a big Word document. It's just a bullet point list of ideas. And as I think of something that might be interesting to write about, I just write it down there. And there's like 50 or 60 or 70 bullet points in that list. And some of them are really stupid. I'll never write them. Some of them are brilliant. I just don't know which ones. And then when I feel like writing something, I write it. I used to say I did it in airport departure lounges. I haven't done that for a while, but it's similar kinds of time. I tend to do it in time when I'm not feeling very productive otherwise. If I'm waiting for an appointment, or if I have just 15 minutes between things, something like that. And then, sometimes I'll have like 5 or 6 things queued up in advance. I'm a month ahead of myself. And sometimes I'll be, oh crap, I've got to get something out for like Monday, because I really don't want to fall below about a post a week, because there's some evidence that audiences respond well to regularity as well. If you're predictably putting out new content, and about weekly seems to be kind of the some kind of sweet spot for below which audiences don't remember to come back. So sometimes I get kind of stressed if I don't have something ready a few days in advance. That was very detailed. I don't know if you want that much detail, I'm sorry, but that's how I do it. Anybody else?
I have another question.
Sure.
When Aura and I both started to conceive of this program and sat down to write the grant that is financing this, and by the way, shout out of a thank you to Burroughs Wellcome Fund, who is making all this possible. One of the reasons we thought science communication was, or STEM communication was so important, is because some of the biggest problems that mankind is facing right now will require multidisciplinary teams of people to collaborate to solve them. Both multidisciplinary teams of scientists, but also scientists working with business people, working with government officials, etc. So do you have any thoughts on, one of the things I understand is that multidisciplinary work is very difficult because there's so many conventions within disciplines, and there's conflict that arises in these teams because it's not clear what the etiquette is. So for people like me and Aura who want to encourage these kind of multidisciplinary writing teams, do you have advice on how to navigate that?
So you're bang on. I mean, you know, this multidisciplinary stuff is so important, and you mentioned a bunch of the styles, and one you didn't mention, but I'm sure you would have, is scientists working with social scientists, and scientists working with people in the humanities. And yes, so we have all these conventions around authorship, around structures of papers, around data sharing, around all kinds of things. And I think the only really good advice I can give on that is to have those conversations right up front. Because there's nothing worse than getting 18 months into a project and discovering that the people in field A never, ever, ever post a preprint ever. And people in field B always do because you're laughed at if you don't. Well, if you'd known that on day one, you could have negotiated it out before everyone got down the road. And that's just one trivial example. Like, authorship practices differ. Who's first author, who's last author, who's an author at all, differs across fields. And so just having that up front, and I really find it useful in doing that to, because I've done some of this with, well, just as a trivial example, the illustrator for my book, Emily Damstra, she's a scientific illustrator and has arts background. And I honestly go into it and I say, Emily, I will admit I know nothing about how this is supposed to work. Please educate me. And I think people respond well to that, because what you're trying to do is saying, look, we're a team, and I know that you have skills and approaches that I don't know about. And that's true whether I'm talking to someone in the English department, or the engineering or the business school, or a entrepreneur in the business world or whatever. It sounds hokey, doesn't it? But I think it's really true, that just explicitly casting it as a team thing that needs negotiating right at the front.
So we
It's
need
hokey.
a little contract. Here are the terms of our collaboration almost.
Well, you know, that sounds like overkill, doesn't it? And it doesn't need to be all legalistic, but it's actually worth, writing down, and even just in an email saying, hey, I think this is what we agreed to. People will be authors if they meet this criterion and this one. Writing down, look, I know that in your field, the senior author goes first, but in mine it goes last. So we'll agree to footnote it as equal contribution or whatever. These things are just really awkward when they come up later. Really awkward sometimes.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we're getting close to the end, so I'm happy to take another question or two, but we don't have too much time left. Is there one more, or should we wrap things up, Laura?
Well, I was thinking earlier there was a question from Sarvani, and I don't know if you addressed it. Maybe I missed it, but she asked how do you find time to read books? Like a lot of us who read a lot more when we were undergrads, and then we became grad students and never had time to read again. My little tiny bit of advice is I really like to read short stories, because if I try to tackle a novel and then I don't finish it, then I feel guilty and bad. But, you can read short stories quickly, and it's fun. But, on your blog, you, of course, post, the books that you've read all year, and there are all kinds of different books. So do you have any advice for us mortals who never find time to read?
So, so sorry, Sarvani, that I did miss that one. I must have been in the chat earlier on, and I just didn't see it go by. So look, I happen to do that. I've always, my whole life, I've read a ton of books. That's the thing I do whenever I have downtime, and literally, if I have 10 minutes, that's what I'm doing. And it's not because it's like a sacred mission. It's not because I'm a better person because I read a lot. It's nothing like that. It's just selfishly, this is what relaxes me. This is what I retreat to when things are stressful outside, which God help me this year. Things have been a little stressful out there. I don't know if you noticed. So that's really what it is, where somebody else might do something else. Somebody else might retreat into cooking, or, well, I do that too, but into running, which I used to run, but then I discovered nobody was chasing me, so I quit. There's all kinds of things, and I think everybody has to have some kind of release. Nobody can work all the time. And so whatever it is, it's okay to take time for it, and even schedule in time for downtime. Whatever that thing is for you, it can be Skyrim, it doesn't matter, right? So for me, it happens to be books. So that's why you're seeing those startlingly long lists of books on my blog. And I must admit, I also was startled to see just how many there were. And if audiobooks work for you, as I think Amiante is saying, or if short stories are easier to stick with, it's just the thing that helps you, the thing that works for you. I will say that reading a lot really helps writing, though. Reading anything, not just scientific papers. The more you read, the bigger a toolbox you have, because you notice things, you pick up things, say, ooh, I love this sentence, I could try that. And if you even get in the habit of writing things down you could try later, it's kind of handy to have a folder of little inspirations like that. So I think reading is really a good activity, but everyone has their thing.
Are there any more questions for Dr. Hurd? A lot of good suggestions there. Destiny is all over all the apps and everything.
See, absolutely, I'm very impressed.
Yeah.
I have so many apps, I'm surprised my phone still works.
Okay, well, maybe we'll wrap things up then, and everybody can get a couple minutes of non-screen time. Thanks so much, Dr. Hurd, for coming and speaking with us today. It's been really fun. It's been really informative and entertaining. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And just remember, next Thursday at 4 o'clock will be Deborah Willis again, talking about communicating across diverse teams. So yeah, thanks, everybody. Thanks, Burroughs Welcome, for funding this. And have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody. Really enjoyed that.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.